All right, so I'm just going to grab a box primitive here and I'll drag it out in the scene and we'll just edit the parameters here. We're going to set this to a length of 64 by 64 and we'll give it a height of 16 units. Just keep it nice and even. We'll keep it at those square numbers. And I'm going to do 4 length segments by 4 width segments, and we'll leave it at 1 height segment. And I'm going to come into the material editor here. I'm just going to throw a quick material on it and go into wireframe mode. So you'll notice that when we set those width and height segments, they're pretty much represent perfect squares, and this is just it'll be perfect tessellation for when we bring it into ZBrush, and it also fits with our grid, which is nice. But one thing that I want you guys to kind of associate these pieces of geometry with are think of it in terms of layers in Photoshop. So when you make a new layer in Photoshop and you were to create an element in there, you can move it around the canvas of your Photoshop file, and that's kind of what I meant by thinking of the grid as our Photoshop file. So one thing that's extremely important when we're creating our blockout geometry for our tileable textures in Max is that if we were to go off of the border of that canvas, naturally what we would expect is for it to come back onto the other side. And that's how we create that tiling effect. So before I go into that, I want to go ahead and turn Snaps Toggle on, and I'll just go ahead and click that. Actually, I'm going to right-click Snaps Toggle, and it'll bring up the grid and snap settings. And in the snap tab, we could have it snap to whatever we want, really. Pivot, perpendicular, vertex points, the center of faces. But right now, we're just going to leave it on that default check, which is grid points. So when I move my my box around, that pivot point will snap to the grid. But it all depends on where it is initially. So we're just going to go ahead and set this to 0, 0, 0 in world space, so that centers out to the grid pretty nicely. And now when I move it around, it'll snap to all those grid pieces. So we get this nice and clean placement, which is extremely, extremely important for when you're doing this. It's all about precision here. So if I were to set this mesh off of our what I want to call our tile lines here, and I were to bake this out to a plane, you'd only get to see these 4 squares in the top left hand of our texture map, and it wouldn't tile because if you know anything about tiling, these things have to repeat, and we should be seeing if we were to tile correctly, we'd see these 4 blocks over here and the other 2 down on these other corners over here, because whatever comes off of this plane on the X or Y axis has to be offset to the other side respectively. And I know this is a bit confusing, but we'll get through it, trust me. So the best way to do that in Max is remember how we set our grid up to be 16 units every grid line and 8 units altogether. That gives us 256 by 256 max units that we have to offset this object by in order for it to go over to the other side and repeat. So all you have to do is select your object, hit Control V, and clone it, and we'll go ahead and create a reference, and we'll hit OK. Now hit F12 and bring up the Move Transform Type dialog, and we have what's called Offset World here. And since we already created a reference, we have duplicated this mesh on top of the other mesh, and that's the one we have selected right now. So since this is coming off on the x-axis over here on the left, we have to offset it 256 units on the positive x-axis to the other side. So if we type in 256 over here and we hit enter, it snaps all the way over here. But since this is also coming off of the grid on the y-axis, we'll select both of these again, hit Control V, make a reference, and now we have to offset it negative 256 units on the negative y-axis to get those to come back down here. So if we do negative 256 and send it back down here, we'll now have a perfectly tiling map if we were to render this a texture, because we have all of our corners covered. The good thing about making references too is that if we were to change any of the properties of this box, like say we were to give it another length segment, it changes the same on all of these references we just made, which is really nice. But for now, we're just going to leave that at 4 by 4. All right, so now we're going to go ahead and create another block for us to use. So I'm going to come back into the Create tab here, and we're going to draw a box out. And the other cool thing about having snap turned on is that we could snap our box size with the grid as well. So if I want to do something that's 4 by 3, it's extremely easy for me to do that. I just have to go ahead and drag it to match those grid numbers and pull it up. And it should snap at 16, and we'll set our length segments to 3 there to maintain that perfect tessellation there. Come back into the Modify tab, and now we could move this block around and have it snap to the grid. So I'm going to go ahead and just drag this up here off of the underneath of our 4x4 block here. And you might be wondering why I keep placing these blocks on the outside edge, and why I'm not just keeping it simple by making sure that everything is just fits nice and snug inside of our grid here. And the answer is because we have to break up our tiling plane if we want our map to appear like it's not obviously tiling. So if we were to line up our geometry perfectly so that it fit nice and snug inside of here, and we took it into a game engine and we tiled it around, it would be apparent that it is a tiling texture, because you'd be able to find the line in between all of these tiles where the end of the texture map pretty much ends. So we just need to break that up a little bit and make sure that we're scattering these around nice and even. But that starts to get a little tricky after a while, because you'll be building everything in your grid and you'll realize that you might have overlapping pieces. So the number one thing to do is to make sure that you compensate on the other side of the grid for how many blocks you go off, or how many grid units you go off. So we're going off by 2 on this left side here, so we have to make sure that we leave these 2 blank over here. And most of the time when I do build these textures, I don't even have these blocks in place. I kind of just leave them blank because we test for the tiling once we're all finished up placing everything. And if we were to do that, as you'll see later in this chapter, they kind of get in the way. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to delete them from now, and I'm just going to go ahead and build out this left side here real quick. So we have our second block made already, so let's go ahead and make a couple more that we're going to use and kind of fit together like puzzle pieces here to get our base geometry down. So what I'm going to do off camera is I'm going to create 4 more bricks of different sizes that we're going to use to place the rest of these bricks. And I'm going to pause the video, and when I come back they should all be made. Okay, so I've gone ahead and just created 4 more shapes. I did a 2x2, a 3x3, a 2x3, and a 2x4 over here, and we're going to use these for the rest of our geometry here. So I'm going to grab the 3x3 and we'll just move that up here, and remember we're going to get a nice break in that tile line here, so that's why we're doing that. And then I'm going to go ahead and grab the 2x3 here, and I'll rotate it by 90 degrees. And if you go ahead and turn on angle snap toggle, it makes rotating in Max a lot easier because it'll snap to every 5 degrees. So I'm going to go ahead and move that all the way up here, and I'll just offset that by 1 grid over here to once again make that break that tile line up a little bit. And let's see, we'll go ahead and do a shift drag, which will duplicate that same object down. Just make a copy of that, and I'll rotate that another 90 degrees and place it right here. And I'm going to leave these 2 spaces open, because when we offset this all the way down to here again, we're going to need those 2 spaces or we'll get overlapping areas. So that's one thing that I like to do is when I'm doing one of these textures, I like to flesh out the axes first to make sure that I don't run into any errors later on. So now that this left x-axis is done, we're going to go ahead and take care of this top, the positive y-axis edge up here. Alright, so another thing I just noticed really quick is that I forgot to change the length segments over here to 5. I noticed that it wasn't really lining up to that grid that well. So for this top part up here, I'm gonna use this 2x4 quite a lot because it's irregularly shaped and I want to avoid a lot of square tiles. So I'll drag that up there, make a copy of that, and I'll rotate that about 90 degrees. And let's set that like so, so we have a little bit of an offset up there. And then I'll make another copy of that, and we'll rotate that by another 90 degrees and set that up like that. And I'll go ahead and make another shape here, another box. And let's do something we don't have yet. Let's do a 2x3 by 16. Sounds pretty nice. And make that 2x3. Go ahead and assign a material to that. And we will place that right here. And we'll just copy another one over like that. And if you remember from before, I'm going to leave these two in the top right-hand corner empty to compensate for when we offset. And that should pretty much do it for the border of our textures. So a way to test the tileability of this is just to grab the entire thing, hit Control-V, make a reference, go ahead and hit F12 to bring up your Move Transform type if you close that out, and we'll offset that by 256. And when we do that, we shouldn't get any overlapping areas, but it should all fit in nice and snug here. And to test the y-axis, we could grab everything again, make a reference, and offset it on the negative 256 and the y, and bring it down like so. And you'll see that we just offsetted it, but it tiles. There aren't any overlapping shapes. And now the only thing that we have to worry about is filling in this area right here. It's actually very simple. Like I said, all you have to do is remember that to compensate for however many grid units you go off on the left-hand side over on the right. So since we didn't go, I don't think we did, yes. So since we didn't go over any units over here on the negative x-axis, and this got duplicated over, if we were to delete that, you'll notice that it doesn't even really touch that grid size because we stayed on the grid over here. But for this one underneath of it, it goes 1 unit over on the left side. So if we were to delete this, we'll see that it takes up these 2 grid points over here on the right-hand side. So I hope you guys understand that. Yeah, I don't really want to spend too much more time on that, but we'll see once again how important this is once we get out of ZBrush and we bring all of our other high detail geometry back into Max. So I'm just going to delete all of that, and I'm going to pause the video and reconstruct, not reconstruct, but fill in all these gaps so you don't have to watch me kind of puzzle piece all this together. Unfortunately, if you want to make a texture that isn't apparent that it's tiling completely, you do have to take a little bit of extra time and make sure that you break up that tiling plane, or you're not going to get a map that looks like it's naturally occurring. In other words, you won't get a map that is apparently tiling, and that's exactly what we're going to go for. So I'm just going to go ahead and pause this, and when we come back, we should have everything all set to go, and I'll demonstrate its tileability again once we get back. All right, so I've gone ahead and taken the time to place the rest of our bricks in a manner that kind of fits the whole philosophy of what I was talking about. Just got everything fitting all snug up in here, and I guess this is the best time to take another opportunity to talk about that offset on the grid here. And the most obvious case would be this guy right here. He goes off the grid by a whole 3 units, or 3 grid units up here. So if I were to make a reference of this and offset it on the negative axis by 256 units, it fits nice and snug in that hole down here. And that's kind of exactly what I've been talking about in terms of making sure that you're compensating for that space. Because when we do a test to make sure that this tiles, we need everything to fit nice and snug. Another thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight all of these and I'm going to right click and convert this to an editable poly to make all these editable poly objects. And to do the tile test, I'm just going to temporarily turbo smooth all of these. So I'm going to select them all and go to the modifier list, and I'm going to add a turbo smooth modifier. And we'll just leave that at 1 right now so you can kind of just see the individual pieces. And we're not going to leave them like this. This is just to show you what it's going to look like when it's tileable. And a good way to make sure that it is testing that it's tileable when you have shapes that are kind of ambiguous looking and you can't tell where one starts and the other begins, which is often the case when you're making geometrically precise shapes in Max. So I'm going to select everything. I'm going to Control V and make a reference, and I'll offset that by 256 on the x-axis. And notice how it fits perfectly into place here. And I'm going to select everything again, and I'm going to make a reference, and I'm going to offset it on the negative 256 on the y. And look, everything fits nice and snug. We can put a render plane anywhere that we want on here and render it to texture, and it's going to tile perfectly. And that's why it's so important to make sure that everything is precise, because if it wasn't, if one little area was off, you're going to get a seam that you're going to have to correct, and that's just going to take a bunch of time. So I'm going to undo all this, and I'm going to get rid of this turbo smooth modifier here, and our geometry right now is ready to go into ZBrush. It's already perfectly tileable. It's got nice tessellation. All we have to do is export it. Now, before we export it, if you do not want to go through the process of placing all these things yourself, you could find this file just how it is. It's called texture_base.max, and it'll be included with the download or the DVD. So just go ahead and open up that if you're just doing this to kind of follow along. If you want to challenge yourself, go ahead and try and lay something out that tiles properly. It'll take you a little bit of time, and it definitely took me a little bit of time. No one ever gets it perfect their first time through, and I still really often make some errors. But it'll be good practice if you try and do it on your own. But if not, that's perfectly fine. To export this, all we have to do is drag a box around and select everything, and come here to the top left of Max into our Max tab, and go to Export, Export Selected, and I'm just going to go ahead and save this as 4 tiles_base, and I'm going to go ahead and make sure that I'm saving that out as a .obj file, because if you save it as an FBX or a .3ds, it's not going to be able to be imported into ZBrush. So we have to make sure that that's an OBJ. I'm going to go ahead and hit save, and that'll bring up my OBJ export options dialog box, and there's a bunch of different options here that we can play around with, but we don't have to worry about that, thankfully, because we could just set it to the ZBrush preset. And this is really cool because if I wanted to take this into Maya or Modo or Mudbox or any other program, I could just set that default preset like so, but for now I'm just going to leave it at ZBrush, and it'll automatically highlight all the things that we need to bring it into ZBrush. So I'm just going to go ahead and set that and hit export, and it'll go ahead and do its business. And I'm going to hit done, and that's pretty much it. We are now ready to go into ZBrush and import our OBJ that we just exported out and add some more detail to it to make it look really awesome. That pretty much does it for Chapter 1. I will see you in Chapter 2.